Welcome back to Sacred Healing and Wholeness. For those who may be joining for the first time, I am Pastor Amy. Just for transparency, I have pastored for more than 2 decades, certified life coach, and I have earned degrees in psychology, substance abuse counseling, human service counseling, and clinical mental health counseling. And so my passion is helping people understand that faith and mental health are not enemies. They're not competing conversations. They are two parts of how God cares for his people. And so this community exists because because healing exists, not just surviving, not just functioning, not just appearing okay, healing, real healing, the kind of healing that reaches beneath the surface and touches the places nobody else sees. And so today I wanted to talk about a truth that can be difficult to hear, but absolutely necessary for growth. And the subject matter is the wound may not have been your fault, but your healing is still your responsibility. Every small step forward matters. Now, before anybody, please, becomes defensive, let me say this clearly. There are wounds that people never deserved. There are wounds that have been created by betrayal, wounds created by abandonment, neglect, by abuse, wounds created by words that should never have been spoken, by experiences that never should have happened. There are people listening now who were harmed by decisions of someone else. And so, my point today is you did not choose what happened. You did not ask for what happened. You did not deserve what happened. And acknowledging that truth absolutely matters because healing is never helped by pretending the wound wasn't real. Sometimes people hear messages about responsibility and they immediately assume blame. Responsibility and blame are not the same thing. Blame says whose fault this is, and responsibility says what do I do now. And so there are those are two opposite ends of the coin. And so you can be completely innocent of causing the injury and still be responsible for caring for it. Is that fair? Perhaps not, but it is a human reality. And so if someone accidentally breaks your arm, you didn't cause the break, but eventually you still have to take the responsibility to go to the doctor. You still have the responsibility of wearing the cast, the responsibility of rehabilitation, the responsibility to participate in the healing process. The injury was not your fault, but healing, unfortunately, and this process called life is your responsibility. And so the same principle often applies emotionally and spiritually. One of the greatest mistakes people make is waiting for the person who hurt them to become the person who heals them. Sometimes that never happens. Sometimes the apology never comes. The explanation never comes. The accountability never comes. The relationship never gets repaired. Sometimes the person who wounded you continues living life as if nothing happened. And if your healing depends upon their participation, your future becomes chained to their choices. And so God never intended for your future to be held hostage by somebody else's decision. There comes a moment when healing becomes a personal commitment, a sacred decision, a declaration that says, I cannot change what happened, but I can decide what happens next. And so that is where healing begins, not when everything becomes fair, not when every question gets answered or when every wound disappears overnight. Healing begins when you decide that the pain will not be allowed to write the rest of your story. One of the most damaging lies that people believe is that healing has to happen all at once. So many people approach healing with unrealistic expectations. They want one prayer, one breakthrough, one counseling session. They want one conversation, one revelation, and then they expect years of pain to disappear immediately. And that's not realistic because sometimes God does, even though sometimes God does perform miraculous healing, But oftentimes, healing is a process. It's a journey. It's a series of small, faithful steps, a gradual rebuilding, a slow restoration, a daily decision. And that can be frustrating because our culture celebrates dramatic transformation. We love before and after stories. We love overnight success. We love instant results, but God often works differently. Scripture repeatedly shows us God who values process, a God who forms, who develops, who matures, who strengthens over time. And sometimes healing happens one choice at a time, one boundary, one prayer, one conversation, one healthy decision, one day at a time. And that does not make the healing less valuable. In fact, some of the strongest healing comes through consistency. And so many people overlook the power of small progress because they are focused on dramatic progress. But small progress changes lives. I want you to think about how a tree grows. You do not watch a tree and see dramatic growth every day. You don't stand outside and say, it grew 3 feet this afternoon. The growth is happening gradually, quietly, consistently. Yet years later, that same tree is strong enough to withstand storms. And so healing often works exactly the same way. One day you realize you cried for 15 minutes instead of 3 hours. That's growth. That matters. One day you might realize the memory still hurts, but it no longer controls your entire day. That is growth. One day you may realize you spoke kindly to yourself instead of criticizing yourself. You may realize you set a boundary you never would have set before, or you realize you asked for help instead of isolating, or you are beginning to trust God again. Every small step forward matters. And so the enemy often tries to convince people that if they're not completely healed, they have made no progress. And that simply is not true. Progress is still progress. Growth is still growth. Movement is still movement. And every healthy step deserves recognition. One practical exercise I want to give you today is called the evidence journal. And so for the next 7 days, I want you to write down one piece of evidence that healing has occurred. Not perfection, evidence. Maybe you handle stress differently. Maybe you challenged the negative thought. Maybe you spent 5 minutes in prayer. Maybe you took a walk. Maybe you rested. Maybe you reached out to someone. Maybe you chose um, uh, honesty instead of pretending. I simply want you to write it down, because when people are healing, they often become so focused on what still hurts that they overlook what is improving. Healing deserves to be noticed. It deserves to be acknowledged, to be celebrated, and God deserves praise for every step forward. One of the most beautiful truths in the scripture is that God does not despise small beginnings. He understands process and growth and development. He understands that healing often unfolds one layer at a time. And so you don't have to become completely whole by tomorrow. You don't have to have every answer today or to fix everything this week. Your responsibility is not perfection. Your responsibility is participation. It's showing up. It's taking the next healthy step. Your responsibility is cooperating with God, is cooperating with what God is doing inside you. And every small step forward matters more than you realize, because those small steps eventually become a healed life. Those small steps become renewed strength. Those small steps become restored confidence. They become freedom. Those small steps become wholeness. And one day you'll look back and realize that God was healing you long before you recognize how much progress had actually occurred. And secondly, I want to point out that healing is not betrayal. One of the hidden barriers to healing is something many people never recognize. Sometimes people resist healing because deep down, healing feels like betrayal. Not betrayal of God, not betrayal of themselves, but betrayal of the pain. And so I know that sounds strange when we say it out loud, but it happens more often than most people realize. There are people who have carried wounds for so long that the wound has become a part of their identity. The hurt has become familiar. The pain has become familiar. The disappointment, the grief, the anger has become familiar. And when healing begins to happen, it can feel uncomfortable because it requires letting go of something that has been emotionally familiar for years. And so even painful things can become familiar, and familiar things often feel safe. Many people know how to be wounded. They know how to expect disappointment. They know how to expect rejection and abandonment, but they do not know how to live from a place of healing. That feels unfamiliar. And anything unfamiliar can feel uncomfortable. One of the things I often tell people is healing does not dishonor what happened to you. Healing honors what God wants to do for you and in you and through you. And so those are two different things. Sometimes people feel guilty when they start feeling better. Have you ever noticed that someone starts laughing again, then they feel guilty. Someone starts enjoying life again, then they feel guilty. Someone starts experiencing peace again, then they feel guilty. They start building healthy relationships again, then they feel guilty. Almost as if continuing to suffer somehow proves how much they cared. But suffering is not a measurement of love. Suffering is not a measurement of loyalty or faithfulness. Remaining wounded forever does not prove the wound mattered. The wound mattered simply because it happened. It mattered because it hurt you. It mattered because it affected you. And so you do not have to continue bleeding to prove that you were injured. You don't have to remain broken to prove that something broke. And you don't have to stay stuck to prove something happened. And so healing does not erase history. Healing simply changes your relationship with history. The event may always be a part of your story, but the event does not have to remain the center of your story. For some people, every conversation eventually circles back to their wound or their broken place. Every decision is filtered through the wound, or every relationship, every opportunity, every risk is filtered through the wound. The wound becomes the lens through which everything is viewed, but healing begins when the wound stops being the primary narrator of your life. You start seeing yourself differently. You start seeing God differently, your future, your possibilities different. And so the wound may still be a part of the story, but it no longer controls the entire narrative. And so I want to talk for a moment about emotional responsibility. Emotional responsibility. Now, notice I did not say emotional blame. I said emotional responsibility. So many people spend years waiting for someone else to manage emotions that only they can change. They're waiting for someone else to make them feel worthy, or to feel secure, or to feel valuable, or to feel complete. But eventually we discover that no human being has enough power to heal everything inside of another person. People can support you, encourage you, they can pray with you, walk beside you, love you, but healing still requires your participation. The work cannot be outsourced. The responsibility cannot be delegated. No one can heal for you. No one can pray for you enough to replace your own relationship with God. No one can grow for you, or mature for you, or confront your fears for you, or establish your boundaries for you, or practice your healing habits for you. Healing is primarily personal. And so one of the reasons this truth is important is because empowerment begins where responsibility takes place. Empowerment begins where responsibility takes place. Victimization will say everything is happening to me, but healing said something happened to me, but I still have choices. And so the first statement leaves you powerless, but the second statement restores agency. And agency matters because one of the most devastating effects of emotional wounds is the feeling of powerlessness. Many people describe their wounds by saying, I had no control, I had no voice, I had no choice, I couldn't stop it, I couldn't change it. And those experiences leave emotional scars. But healing involves rediscovering the places where choices still exist. And so you may not control what happened, but you can control how you respond. You may not control yesterday, but you can influence today. You may not control the behaviors of others, but you can decide what access they have to your life. You may not control every circumstance, but you can choose how you care for yourself within the circumstances. And so those choices matters. Those choices become building blocks of healing. And so I want to challenge something else today. Many people underestimate the power of ordinary faithfulness. We often think healing requires dramatic moments, right? Boom, bah. But sometimes healing looks surprisingly ordinary. For example, just going to bed on time, or getting your water in, or taking a walk, maybe reading just a verse of scripture, praying a really honest prayer, journaling, calling a trusted friend, or practicing gratitude. Maybe it's just resting today. Maybe it's simply saying no, keeping a commitment to yourself. And none of those things by themselves sounds dramatic. But healing is often built through ordinary acts that we repeat consistently. Think about how a house is built, right? No one is celebrating every nail, every screw or board, but every piece contributes to the finished structure. And healing works much the same. One healthy decision may seem insignificant, but repeated healthy decisions create a healthy life. One healthy thought may seem by itself insignificant, but repeated healthy thoughts create healthier patterns. One healthy boundary alone may seem insignificant, but repeated boundary setting creates emotional safety. And so, same with prayer, right? Never underestimate small acts of faithfulness. God often does extraordinary things through ordinary obedience. And so, there may be someone listening now who feels discouraged because healing feels slow. You thought you'd be further along by now. Thought you'd feel stronger. The pain would be gone. You thought the struggle would be over by now. But I want to encourage you tonight. Slow healing is still healing. Gradual healing is still healing. Quiet healing is still healing. Unnoticed healing is still healing. So do not measure your progress slowly by what you still struggle with. Also measure it by what no longer controls you. Measure it by the habits you've changed, the boundaries you've established, the wisdom you've gained, the strength you've developed, the perspective you've acquired, the peace you've discovered. Because every small step forward matters, and every healthy choice is evidence that God is continuing his work within you. God is continuing his work in you. And then thirdly, the third thing I want to discuss is healing the beliefs the wound created. I want to take a minute to talk about healing the beliefs the wound created. One of the most important things to understand about emotional wounds is that wounds rarely remain just experiences. They often become a belief system or pattern. And so this is where many people unknowingly get stuck. The event happened once, but the belief created by the event or the act or the betrayal, the disappointment or the pain, that's the event, continues repeating itself for years, sometimes for decades. And so a wound may have occurred in a moment, but the interpretation of that wound can influence a lifetime. Beliefs formed during that experience continue operating beneath the surface. And so this is why healing requires more than simply moving on. Healing requires examining what the wound taught you. Because not everything a wound teaches is true. In fact, wounded places often become breeding grounds for distorted conclusions. Let me say that for somebody in the back. Wounded places or broken places often become breeding grounds for distorted conclusion. A person experiences rejection and begins believing I'm not wanted, right? A person experiences abandonment and suddenly their belief is people always leave me. Or they experience betrayal and the wound convinces them no one can be trusted. A person experiences repeated criticism and begins believing I will never be enough. A person experiences failure and begins believing I always mess things up. Notices what happened. An event now becomes an identity. An experience becomes a belief. A moment becomes a lens. And eventually that lens begins influencing everything in every relationship. And so this is one reason healing can feel so difficult. You are not only healing from what happened, but oftentimes you are also healing from what you came to believe because of what happened. And so many people spend years fighting circumstances while never addressing the beliefs that were developed beneath the surface of those circumstances. Yet beliefs shape behavior. Those beliefs will shape your choices and your relationships and your expectations and your reactions. And so if I believe I am unworthy, I will often accept treatment that reinforces that belief. Right? If I believe people cannot be trusted, I may push away even healthy people before they have an opportunity to prove themselves trustworthy. If I believe I am destined to fail, I may stop trying before success has a chance to develop. The belief becomes self-protective, but it also becomes self-limiting. And so one of the questions I often encourage people to ask themselves is, what story am I telling myself about this wound or this betrayal or this disappointment? Right? What is the story? Not what happened, not what someone else did. What story have I convinced myself about it? Because the story matters. The interpretation, the meaning, it matters. Two people can experience similar pain and arrive at very different conclusions. One person says, this hurt me, but I can heal. Another person might say, this hurt me and I will never recover. Same wound, different belief, different outcome. And so this is why scripture repeatedly emphasizes the importance of doing what? Of renewing the mind. God understands something many people overlook. Transformation begins in the realm of thinking. The battlefield is frequently internal before it ever becomes external. The conversations happening inside your mind, they matter. The words you repeatedly speak to yourself, they matter. The assumptions you carry, they matter. The conclusions you have accepted matter, because eventually those internal realities begin influencing your external realities. And so I want to pause here, because someone listening right now may have spent years carrying a belief that God never intended for them to carry. Maybe that there was a wound or betrayal that convinced you that you are broken beyond repair. Maybe that wound convinced you that you are difficult to love, or that you are permanently damaged, or that your best days are behind you. Maybe that wound convinced you that healing is for everyone else but for you. I want to challenge that today. A wound can be real without becoming your identity. That wound, a struggle can be real without becoming your identity. A season can be real. An experience can be real without becoming your identity. You are more than what happened to you. You are more than what hurt you. You are more than what disappointed you. You are more than what broke your heart. You are more than the chapter that wounded you. One of the dangers of unhealed wounds is that they often cause people to confuse what happened with who they are. That is a costly mistake, because once identity becomes attached to pain, healing can feel threatening. It can feel threatening if pain has become a part of how I define myself. Then who am I without it? And so this is why healing often involves rediscovering identity, not creating identity, but rediscovering it, because God established your value long before the wound ever even occurred. God established your worth long before the disappointment occurred. He established your purpose. The wound may have hidden those truths, but it did not erase what God has already said about you. There's another important reality that we need to discuss. Many people become frustrated because they keep encountering the same patterns, the same relational struggles, same fears, same insecurities, same emotional reactions, and they wonder why. Sometimes it is because the underlying belief has never been addressed. Imagine trying to remove weeds without addressing the roots. You may temporarily improve the appearance of the garden, but eventually the weeds are going to do what? They're going to return. Not because you've failed to remove the weeds. They're going to return because the root remained. And so healing requires us to examine roots. What beliefs are feeding this pattern? What assumptions are driving this reaction? What conclusion am I operating from? What messages have I accepted without questioning? And so those kinds of questions matter because healing often begins with awareness. You cannot change what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot confront what you refuse to identify, and you cannot challenge what remains hidden. And so this is why honesty is so important in healing. Not condemnation. I'm not talking about condemnation. I'm talking about honesty. Not talking about shame. I'm talking about honesty. Not self-criticism, but honesty. God can work with honesty. God can meet us in honesty. God can heal what is honestly surrendered to him. Another practical tool that I want to give you today is called the belief audit. And so this week, if you could just take a minute or two a day, whenever you experience a strong emotional reaction, I just want you to pause and ask yourself, what am I believing right now? What am I believing right now? I don't want you to ask yourself what I'm feeling. I want you to ask yourself, what am I believing right now? Because feelings often point toward beliefs. For example, if I feel overwhelming fear, what belief is fueling that fear? If I feel intense rejection, what belief is fueling that reaction? If I feel hopeless, what is fueling that hopelessness? And then I just want you to jot it down. And then once you jot it down, I want you to ask a second question. Is this belief actually true? Not is it familiar, not comfortable, not understandable, but is it true? And because many beliefs feel true because they have been repeated for years. But repetition does not create truth. Only truth creates truth. And sometimes healing begins when we finally challenge beliefs that have quietly controlled our lives for far too long. And so as you move forward, remember this. Healing is not simply recovering from the wound. Healing is also learning to see yourselves, to see others, and to see God through a healthier lens. And that process, the reality is it takes time, it takes grace, it takes patience. But every time you challenge a false belief, you are taking another step toward victory. You're taking another step toward freedom and wholeness. Every time you replace a lie with truth, you're taking another step toward wholeness. Every time you refuse to let the wound define you, you are taking another step toward healing. And every one of those steps matters because healing is not built in a single moment. It's built one truth at a time. And then fourthly, I want to talk about this. When healing feels unfair. When healing feels unfair. Sometimes fourthly, I want to talk about this. When healing feels unfair. When healing feels unfair. Sometimes, in fact, if we're completely honest, there are moments in healing journey when it feels deeply unfair. And it feels unfair because you're not responsible for the wound. You didn't choose it. You didn't create it. You didn't ask for the disappointment. You didn't cause the abandonment. You didn't create dysfunction. You didn't choose the loss, yet somehow you are the one doing the work. You're the one reading the books. You're the one attending counseling. You're the one praying. You're the one setting boundaries. You're the one learning healthier patterns. You're the one confronting difficult emotions. Meanwhile, the person who caused the damage may appear to be moving through life untouched by the consequences. And if we're honest, there are moments when that reality can be the most frustrating. And so there are moments when the question naturally arises. Why do I have to do all this work when I wasn't the one who caused the problem? And so if you ever felt that way, I promise you, you're not alone. So many people have asked that question. So many people have wrestled with that frustration. And so many have experienced that kind of tension. And the reason we must address this honestly is because unresolved resentment about the healing process can quietly become another obstacle to the healing. And so sometimes people become stuck because they are waiting for fairness. They are waiting for balance. They are waiting for the scales to be even. They are waiting for life to somehow compensate them before they move forward. But healing doesn't work that way. The truth is that life is not always fair, unfortunately. And acknowledging that reality is not pessimism, it's maturity. There are situations where innocent people suffer. Fact. There are situations where good people experience heartbreak. Facts. There are situations where faithful people experience disappointments. There are situations where consequences fall unevenly. Facts. The question then becomes, what will you do with that reality? Will you allow the unfairness to become your another prison, or will you choose to move toward healing anyway? One of the most powerful shifts that occurs during healing is when a person stops asking, why did this happen to me? And begins asking, what do I need to do now? And the first question keeps you focused on the past. The second question moves you toward the future. The first question searches endlessly for explanations. The second question searches for solution. The first question often leaves you powerless. The second question restores your ability to act. So please hear me. I'm not suggesting that processing the past is unimportant. It is important. Understanding what happened matters. Acknowledging what happened matters. Grieving what happened matters. But eventually, healing is going to require you to move from that place. Eventually, healing is going to require some action from you. It's going to require participation, because healing is not something that merely happens to us. Healing is something we must cooperate with. And so one of the things I've observed over the years is that people often underestimate how much energy resentment consumes. Resentment can become emotionally exhausting. It requires constant replaying of events, constant revisiting of energy, constant rehearsing of disappointment, constant mental arguments, constant emotional reactivation. And all of that consumes energy, energy that could otherwise be invested in growth or healing or in becoming. One reason healing matters is because your future deserves your energy more than the past does. And I just want you to think about that for a second. Your future deserves your energy. Your purpose, your calling, your relationships, your growth, your peace deserves your energy. And so every day spent emotionally chained to yesterday is a day that cannot be fully invested in today. And so that doesn't mean we ignore the pain. It means we refuse to build a permanent residence at the doorstep of the pain or the wound. And so there is another reality that often surprises people. Healing frequently involves grieving not only what happened, but what should have happened. So many people understand grieving losses. Few people understand grieving absences. Sometimes the deepest grief comes from what was missing. The support that should have been there, the protection that should have been, the encouragement, the affection, the guidance, the apology, the safety that should have been there. And so those absences can also create wounds. And healing often requires acknowledging them, because if we refuse to grieve them, we may spend years trying to collect emotional debts from people who can never repay them. And that is a painful place to live. Waiting for someone to become what they have repeatedly demonstrated that they cannot be waiting for someone to give what they have repeatedly demonstrated that they do not possess, waiting for someone to heal wounds they refuse to acknowledge. Healing sometimes means accepting realities, not because reality is pleasant, not because reality is real. Acceptance is not approval. Acceptance is clarity. Acceptance says, this is what happened, this is what is, this is what I have, this is what I do not have. And from that place of clarity, healthier decisions become possible. One of the greatest gifts healing gives us is the ability to stop negotiating with reality. We stop trying to make people into who we wish they were. We stop trying to rewrite history. We stop trying to force outcomes. We stop trying to manufacture control. And instead, we begin focusing on what God is inviting us to do right now. And so healing is not about changing the past. Healing is about changing our relationship with the past. That event may remain unchanged. What happened to you is going to remain unchanged, but your relationship with what happened to you can change. The memory may remain, but its influence can change. The story may remain, but the power it holds on you or over you can change. And that's where healing becomes incredibly hopeful, because even when the past cannot be altered, the future remains unwritten. So another practical tool that I like to give you today is called the circle of responsibility exercise. And that's where you're going to just take a piece of paper. You'll draw 2 circles. In the first circle, you'll write things I cannot control. In the second circle, you'll write things I can control. And then in each circle, you begin listing honestly. You cannot control someone else's choices, someone else's apology, someone else's willingness. You cannot control yesterday. You can't control behavior of other people, but you can control your responses. You can control your boundaries, your habits, your healing practices, your honesty, your willingness to grow, where you invest your energy. And so what this exercise does, this exercise often reveals how much emotional energy we spend trying to control things that are outside of our responsibility. And so healing becomes more effective when we focus our attention on what actually belongs to us. Because responsibility is not punishment. Responsibility is empowerment. Responsibility is where influence begins. It's where growth begins. It's where healing begins. And while it may feel unfair that you must do healing work for wounds you did not create, there's also something profoundly hopeful about that reality, because it means your future is not dependent upon the people who hurt you. It means your freedom is not dependent upon their apology. Your growth is not dependent upon their cooperation. Your healing is not dependent upon their awareness. God can continue his work in your life regardless of what they choose. And that is good news, because while you may not control what happened, you do have a voice in what happens next. And every small step you take toward healing is a declaration that the wound will not have the final word. God's healing work will. Your growth will. Your faith will. Your wholeness will. And every single step forward matters. Every single step. Every single step. And so as we began moving toward the conclusion of this conversation today, I want to talk about one more thing that almost everyone experiences during their healing journey, and that is discouragement. Discouragement. Not because healing isn't happening, but because healing isn't happening as quickly as we expected. One of the most difficult parts of healing is that progress is often easier to see looking backward than it is while living through it. And so when you're in the middle of the process, it can feel as though nothing is changing. You may still have emotional days, difficult moments, triggered sometimes, have questions, still struggle. And because those things are still present, you may mistakenly assume that healing is not occurring. But healing is not the absence of struggle. Healing is evidenced by how different is often evidenced by how differently you respond to the struggle. And so this is an important distinction. Years ago, the difficult day may have completely consumed you. Now it lasts an hour instead of a week. That's healing. Years ago, disappointment may have caused you to isolate completely. Now you reach out for support. That's healing. Years ago, criticism may have shattered your confidence for days. Now you recover more quickly. That is healing. Years ago, maybe anxiety would have convinced you to stop moving forward. Now you keep moving even while feeling uncomfortable. That is healing. And so many people fail to recognize healing because they are measuring perfection instead of progress. But perfection has never been the goal. Growth is the goal. Maturity, wholeness, forward movement is the goal. And growth rarely happens in a straight line. Most healing journeys contain ups and downs, good days and difficult days, moments of clarity and moments of confusion, moments of strength and moments of vulnerability. And so that doesn't mean you're failing. It means you are human. One of the most damaging expectations people place on themselves is the belief that once healing begins, they should never struggle again. That expectation absolutely is going to create an unnecessary shame. Why? Because then every difficult moment feels like evidence that healing isn't working. Every emotional day feels like failure. Every setback feels like defeat. But setbacks are not the same thing as surrender. A difficult day does not erase months of growth. A difficult season does not erase years of progress. A struggle does not cancel transformation. One moment does not define the entire journey. No parent watches a child fall and concludes that walking is impossible. Falling is understood as a part of the process. The same is true emotionally and spiritually, relationally. Healing involves learning, it involves practice, it involves growth, and growth often concludes moments where we stumble. And so the key is continuing to get back up. The key is to continue to engage and participate, to trust God with the process. And so I want to speak directly to the person who feels tired, the person who feels like healing has taken longer than expected, the person who feels weary from doing the work. I want to talk to the person who feels exhausted from carrying responsibilities they never asked for, the person who feels frustrated because they thought they would be further along by now. Please hear what I am saying on tonight. Do not quit because the process is taking longer than you hoped. Do not abandon the work because it's uncomfortable. Do not stop planting seeds because you cannot yet see the harvest. Some of the most important growth is happening beneath the surface. There are roots developing, strength, wisdom, discernment, resilience, stability developing. And much of that work is occurring long before visible results appear. One of the greatest gifts you can give yourself is patience. Not passive waiting, but patient participation. And so passive waiting says, I'll just wait until I feel different. But patient participation says, I will continue showing up even while the process unfolds. Patient participation keeps praying, keeps learning, keeps practicing healthy habits, keeps setting boundaries, keeps choosing growth, keeps taking responsibility, keeps moving. And over time, those small choices compound. One healthy decision builds upon another. One healthy habit strengthens another. One healthy boundary supports another. One healthy thought challenges another. And eventually, what once felt impossible becomes more natural, not because the journey was easy, but because you stayed engaged. There is another truth I want you to remember. Healing is not only about reducing pain, healing is about increasing your capacity. And so sometimes people define healing exclusively as the removal of discomfort. But healing often includes developing the ability to handle life differently, to respond differently, to recover, to think, to relate, to trust, to live differently. And so healing is not merely about feeling better. It's also about becoming stronger, not hard, not emotionally shut down, not disconnected, just stronger. A healed person is not someone who never experiences pain. A healed person is someone who has developed healthier ways of responding to pain. A healed person is someone who has learned how to remain grounded during difficulty. Someone who no longer allows every wound to determine every decision. A healed person is someone who understands that hardship may visit, but hardship does not get permanent residence. That is growth. That's maturity. That's healing. Another practical exercise that I would like to leave with you is called look back before you look ahead exercise. Look back before you look ahead exercise. Many of us are constantly focused on how far we still have to go. And as a result, we overlook how far we've already come. And so this week, again, I want you to take 1 or 2 minutes a day, and I want you to answer these 2 questions. How do I handle stress differently than I did a year ago? And how do I think and how do I think differently than I did a year ago? And then you can ask the same thing about boundaries, about you developing. And then I just want you to write the answers down. And you may discover evidence of healing that you've been overlooking. You may discover growth that has become so familiar that you stop noticing. You may even discover that God has been working in ways you never fully appreciated. And that realization can become fuel for continuing this journey that you're on. Because healing absolutely requires courage, not the courage to be perfect, but the courage to keep showing up and participating, to keep believing that growth is possible, to keep taking responsibility for the parts that belong to you, the courage to keep moving forward even when progress feels slow. And every time you do that, you are building a life that is stronger, healthier, and more whole than the wound or the betrayal or the disappointment tried to create. That is the work. That is the invitation. And that is why every small step forward matters. And so as I close, I want to bring us back to the central truth of this entire conversation. The wound may not have been your fault, but your healing is still your responsibility. Not because God is punishing you, not because God lacks compassion, not because what happened to you didn't matter, and not because God expects you to simply get over it. Your healing is your responsibility because God loves you too much to leave your future in the hands of people who hurt you. If your healing depended on the person who wounded you, many people would never heal. If your healing depended upon receiving the apology you deserve, you're never going to heal. If your healing depends upon someone finally understanding your pain, you will not heal. If your healing depends upon life becoming fair, you're not going to heal. God's plan has always been bigger than that. His desire has always been to walk with you through the healing process so that your future is not determined by your wounds. One of the things I have learned over the years, both personally and professionally, is that healing is rarely a single decision. Healing is 1,000 decisions, 1,000 moments of choosing growth, choosing truth, choosing honesty, choosing courage, choosing faith, choosing to show up again. And while none of those moments may seem significant by themselves, together they become transformation. And many people are looking for one giant breakthrough while overlooking the power of daily faithfulness. But daily faithfulness changes lives. Daily faithfulness changes minds and changes habits and changes relationships and changes futures. And so there may be someone listening today who feels overwhelmed by the healing journey. Perhaps you're thinking, Pastor Amy, this feels like a lot. And if that's where you are, I want to encourage you with something simple. You do not have to heal your entire life today. You only need to take the next step. That is all. Not the next 50 steps or the next 5, not the entire journey, just the next step. Healing happens one step at a time, one decision, one prayer, one truth, one boundary, one healthy choice at a time. And God will meet you there. Not only at the finish line, not only after we've figured everything out, not only once we're fully healed. God meets us in the process. He'll meet you in the struggle, in the question, in the uncertainty, in the work. One of the most beautiful realities of faith is that God is not waiting for us at the destination. He's walking with us on the journey, because healing can feel lonely at times. There may be days when nobody else sees the work you're doing. Nobody sees the boundaries you're maintaining, the thoughts you are challenging, the habits you're changing, the tears you cry, the prayers you pray, the courage it takes to keep going. But God sees it. He sees every step, every effort, every act of obedience, every choice toward wholeness, every moment you refuse to quit. He sees it all, and none of it is wasted. And so I want to speak directly to the person who feels behind, the person who compares their healing to everybody else's, the person who wonders why they aren't further along, the person who feels discouraged because they still have difficult days. Stop comparing your healing journey. Your healing is not supposed to look like someone else's. Your timeline is not supposed to look like someone else's. Your process is not supposed to look like someone else's. God works uniquely with each person. The goal is not to heal according to someone else's schedule. The goal is to remain committed to the work God is doing within you. Healing is not a competition. Healing is a relationship. It is a relationship with truth, with God, with growth, and with becoming. And relationships develop over time. And so as we close, I want to leave you with a challenge for the next couple of days. I want you to stop asking, am I completely healed yet? And begin asking, what healthy step can I take today? That one shift can change everything. Because healing is not built by obsessing over the finish line. Healing is built by consistently taking the next step. And so maybe your next step is having an honest conversation, or creating a healthy boundary, or journaling. Maybe it's reaching out for support, spending time. Maybe it's just spending time with God. Maybe it's practicing rest. Maybe your next step is challenging a belief that no longer serves you. Maybe your next step is extending grace to yourself. But whatever that next step is, I want you to take it. Not because it solves everything, but because every small step forward matters. Before we close, I want to leave you with this declaration. I want to read it slowly. I want to receive it personally. Allow it to settle in your heart. Here's the healing declaration. What happened to me matters. My pain is real. My wounds are real. My struggles are real. But they are not the end of my story. I will not allow my wounds to become my identity. I will not allow my pain to redefine my future. I will not allow what happened to me to determine who I become. With God's help, I will continue moving forward. With His help, I will continue growing. I will continue healing. I will celebrate progress instead of demanding perfection. I will honor every healthy step. I will acknowledge every victory. I will extend grace to myself during the process. I will trust that God is working even when I cannot see immediate results. And I will remember that every small step forward matters, because healing is happening, growth is happening, strength is happening, wholeness is emerging, and God is not finished with me yet. So I want to thank you for spending this time with me this evening. And if this has encouraged you, I want to challenge you to something. I want to invite you to join our Sacred Healing and Wholeness community, where faith and mental health come together in a safe and supportive environment. Together, we are learning that healing is not weakness, healing is courage, it's stewardship, it's faith in action, and healing is possible. And so until next time, remember, the wound may not have been your fault, but every small step you take toward healing matters. And with God's help, those small steps become a transformed life. Until next time, have a wonderful evening.